my last video, we discussed A. James Gregor's book on Mussolini's intellectuals. The purpose of that book was to track the history of fascist intellectual thought and governance, as well as to dispel communist and left-wing myths surrounding Mussolini's fascist state. In this video, we would like to expand on the debunking of communist myths regarding fascism. Today, we will be analyzing the most popular myth regarding fascism, that being the notion of fascism as capitalism in decay. And also that because of this, fascism is an authoritarian form of capitalism manifested relative to its instability in the face of potential communist revolution. Before proceeding, we ought to steelman the communist position regarding this myth before we refute its points. I think we sum up the communist position in the following points. The first being, the only alternative after capitalism is communism. Following Hegelian logic and dialectical materialism, the only real solution of capitalism is the movement toward communism. 2. Because fascism is not communism, it is capitalism in some form. In particular, a reaction against potential communist uprising. 3. Fascism is no different than capitalism because it maintains class distinctions, and so long as there is a modern class distinction, there is capitalism and exploitation. 4. Fascism is historically funded by elites and elite interests, and is in a sense controlled opposition. I think these 4 points accurately describe the communist position regarding the essence of fascism, and from here we will critique these points logically and using historical evidence. The first 3 points can be critiqued on the basis of logical error in reasoning alone. The first point that, quote, the only alternative after capitalism is communism, following Hegelian logic and dialectical materialism, the only real sublation of capitalism is the movement toward communism, is arbitrary and an unjustified presupposition, in that it assumes a one-to-one false dichotomy of capitalism and communism. It does not justify why this is the case, it merely asserts it. Now, communism is an alternative and is in opposition to capitalism, but it is fallacious to assert that it is the only form of opposition there is. This is for 2 reasons. The first being, as we alluded to before, is that it posits an unjustified false dichotomy. Secondly, its reasoning engages in the false equivalency in that it states fascism is capitalism because it is not communism, and that which is not communism is therefore capitalism. This is also a non sequitur. This is problematic as well because it here unjustly assumes that whatever is not communism is capitalism. Communists will argue that fascism is equivalent to capitalism and that both systems maintain class distinction, and by extension exploitation. However, from the standpoint of communists, this is nonsensical, as communists recognize prior systems such as feudalism having class distinction whilst not being capitalistic. The communists also assume that class therefore leads to exploitation, and this here is also unjustified in that it is laden with preconceived notions of exploitation which remain unjustified as well. The common issues we see so far with the communist critique is that it posits a false dichotomy and that its critique is laden with presuppositions that remain for the most part unjustified and arbitrary, as well as making false equivalencies between fascism and capitalism. I should also add that another problem with the communist notion here that fascism is capitalism in decay because fascism maintains class distinction, well, throughout the history of the Soviet Union, it was always a worker or a proletariat-controlled state. Now, a proletariat-controlled state is a state controlled by class. So long as there's a proletariat, there's a working class. And so communism too, in a way, still preserved the distinction of class, and it just uplifted the proletariat class in positions of power. Communists argue that fascism is controlled opposition and funded by and controlled by the elites. This controlled opposition exists in a twofold sense according to the communists, in that it is an elite-controlled opposition against communists and also a false anti-elitist and pro-people's movement. In other words, the communist maintains that fascism was a tool used by the capitalist elite to wipe out the threat of communism and subdue the instability of the masses by tricking them that fascism was a movement waged in their favor. This then leads to the elite taming the masses whilst getting rid of a truly revolutionary communist movement by replacing it with a fake revolutionary movement. Communists may try to prove this on a twofold basis by saying that the King of Italy had handed Mussolini power and that Mussolini engaged in laissez-faire economic reforms. Let us address these claims one by one. Firstly, the issue with saying that fascism is capitalism in decay is that in Italy at the time it was massively under-industrialized and thus cannot truly be a capitalist economy, as a precondition for capitalism is large-scale industrialization. Capitalism could not have been in decay as capitalism in its actual form did not exist yet in Italy. Now, how did Mussolini get into power exactly? Well, the March on Rome is often attributed to his rise to power, and that was a large part of it. In October 1922, the march of 25,000 to 30,000 black shirts occurred in Rome, and the king feared instability and civil war within Italy, so he granted the fascists some power but limited it just in order not to try and spark a civil war and as well as to try and appease them. Mussolini was handed a position in the government for some time, however, he then demanded more power, and it was granted to him out of fear by the ruling class. So we see here that the elite did not exactly want to give him power, but was rather forced to, or pressured to, over a slow period of time to give him power out of fear and intimidation of a civil war or violence against the ruling class. We now have two elites, the old Italian monarchy and the fascist regime. We can understand this from the perspective of Bertrand de Juvenel, the elite theorist, and his notion of the king is in tension with the aristocracy, and they are in competition for power. The king may grant some power, but only in attempts to tame his opponent. However, his opponent may utilize the masses against the king, or the king may use the masses against the aristocracy, which is usually the case. Which is why de Juvenel named this model the high-low versus middle, or king-peasant versus aristocracy. However, we see that in the case of Italy, it is middle-low versus high. The fascists are the middle power, and the king the high power, and the fascists are attempting to liquidate the king over time, and claim they are on the side of the masses, which now have their backing. And well, this tension basically just proves that they're not unified, because if they're unified, they wouldn't have a tension by definition. As we saw in the previous video I did on fascism, which I refer you all to watch, Mussolini engaged in a laissez-faire economic reform, allowing free markets with some state intervention for a period of time. The goal of this was not to create a liberal nation, but rather the opposite, in that it was to create a capitalist society that can be negated into a fully fascist and corporatist society. The reason that it was created was to bring Italy into an industrial economy so that it can accelerate into a corporatist economy. In order to move toward a socialist economy, you still need mass industry, which capitalism provides the basis for, and this is recognized by communists themselves. Furthermore, if a communist wants to call Mussolini a capitalist for this, they must then call Lenin a capitalist for his new economic policy that lasted from 1922 to 1928, which allowed free markets in Russia to do the same thing Mussolini did in Italy by providing a basis upon which socialism can naturally grow through a capitalistic setting. Both Mussolini and Lenin understood that in order to create their ideal, more socialistic economy, they needed to fertilize the seed of socialism by planting it in the soil of capitalism, which would naturally turn into the tree of socialism, so to speak. Mussolini was a close observer of the Bolsheviks in Russia and was directly inspired by Lenin's reforms in the face of the economic collapse in 1922. After all, Mussolini was previously a Marxist. In essence, you need capitalism before you can get to socialism, as it is defined by being in opposition to capitalism, and this is why Lenin had to do this, and the same goes for corporatism. The mistake made by communists is that the communists or the communist socialists believe that the only form in which capitalist opposition exists is communistic socialism. Now, from here, I will read a Twitter thread from Judas, or at Fascist Livtorio, on Twitter to conclude this video, as he kind of sums up this topic a lot better than I can. Quote, "Who financed Mussolini, and why did he change his mind about World War I? A usual claim among communists, especially in Marxist-Leninist groups, is that fascism was born out of a man that, influenced by money and self-interest, chose to proactively support war and left behind his comrades with no reason. The reality of the matter is that despite all of these claims, as always, they come from two factors: lying and taking things out of historical context. One main example of this would be the famous work of Michael Parenti's book, quote-unquote, Black Shirts and Reds. A book that, although loved by communists, holds on to a lot of claims that lack sources or are directly historically dishonest, which is a reality of the capitalism decay mythos. Most of it stems from it being ignorance or willful dishonesty. If we were to look at Mussolini, especially his early years, we can notice a trend within his person that indicates his troublesome personality, be it on his early years in the Italian Socialist Party or later within the Fasci di Combattimento. He always managed to be that one person causing issues or confronting the ways in which one gets power. As an example of this, we can see his proposal of revolutionary praxis compared to reformist praxis within the Italian Socialist Party. Like Lenin, he considered that change could not be achieved through the means of parliamentary democracy, but through revolutionary means. Young Mussolini would dismiss reformers such as Tagliate socialists. Later on, he would embrace reformist views once in power, compared to revolutionary sentiments within the Fascist Party. As his ideas developed, one could also see his nationalistic notions as early as 1911, where he would display the recognition of nationalism as an important means for revolution, as well as with the paper that Nietzsche had in his development of praxis and ideology. The argument of Mussolini having second interests and changing his mind over nothing gets usually dropped as a means to discredit his views or portray him as a defender of capitalism. Nevertheless, this requires a wider examination of what happens during World War I. Reality of most socialist parties is that they would side with their own nation during the conflict, or they would take a proactive stance of the war. This can be seen in the support of the German Socialist Party for the invasion of Belgium, or with how the British and French Socialist parties also took an active role in pushing for war as a means to revolution. The latter would be a key element of kickstarting Mussolini and Il Popolo d'Italia, but that will be relevant soon. As old dogmatic socialist praxis would teach, if a big conflict among capitalist nations were to arise, the workers, through general strikes, could spark the flame of revolution, to then swiftly destroy the ruling classes and then stop the conflict nevertheless. Mussolini would note that most parties were siding with their own government, and not only that, they were actively pushing for war. In this form, Mussolini would gradually take the stance that the proletariat, once done with the foreign enemy, would take up arms after such. A destructive conflict, and would aim them at the ruling class. The logic for this can be traced to the idea that Marx once said that social revolution usually follows war. Adding up to this logic, and as Nicholas Ferrell points out in his biography of Mussolini, the young Benito would put a shot of Nietzsche against Marxist determinism. Men were not condemned to just stare at the progress of history, men have to make history, and in this sense the proletariat had to make the bourgeoisie war a war of its own. Adding up to this, he would reach his final and most important conclusion, it being that the nation had a stronger grip on the people than class. We also have to point out that he was not the only man on the Italian left changing his view of neutrality. This change in favor of a proactive stance of war could be seen in the Italian left across factions like the Republican, the Reformer Socialists, like Leonida Bizzolatti, revolutionary syndicalists like D'Ambri and Corradini. Even Gramsci would be critical of neutrality, and Gramsci was a communist for those who don't know. Mussolini, in the same fashion as Lenin, would be financed by foreign governments. In his case, the British, in Lenin's case, the Germans. This is usually ignored by Marxist-Leninists, be it Fiat, the British government, etc., all financed Mussolini to do something he was already doing. His views had changed through conviction, and not only that, had it not been for the French Socialist Party, he wouldn't have been able to finance Il Popolo d'Italia. This is oftentimes dismissed and unknown to many, yet it's a reality of how fascism came to be. As a nail on this claim, I can refer to any inquiry made by a socialist majority in Milan in 1915 that concluded that Mussolini only got financement and support after his resignation from Avanti, and that he had not engaged in any sort of moral/professional misconduct. And Avanti was the socialist newspaper that he owned and wrote for. The same would be concluded by a police report in 1919 claiming that his change from partial neutrality to a supporter of war came from passionate beliefs and no influence whatsoever from money or second interests. There's also a claim going around that Mussolini met with a group called Federazione Industriale in 1922 to plan and finance the March on Rome. Nevertheless, not a single source mentions nor backs this claim, aside from Parenti's black shirts and reds. In conclusion, it's a lie. You can go around and read thousands of authors about the March on Rome, and nobody will mention anything similar to it. All one can infer is that Parenti quite literally made this claim up. As the main biographer Felice of Mussolini concluded, the party financed itself through different means and had a majority of members belonging to working class and peasantry. The role of the latter has been explained in previous threads. Fascism indeed had popular support contrary to popular belief. Without anything else to add, know that this will be a series of threads in which you guys can suggest claims that go around to capitalism decay. Moving on here, the author of this thread now critiques Michael Parenti's book Black Shirts and Reds, a book about fascist Italy. If you've discussed fascism before, whether it's in favor or against it, you have more than likely already stumbled upon the argument that fascism was a violent dictatorship of decadent capitalism against the revolting working classes as a means to protect itself. The argument is usually based on the ideas of people such as Grigory Dimitrov, Vladimir Lenin, assuming he did say that, or as a more modern example, Michael Parenti. This pretty much displays that it's mostly a left-wing talking point. So for this thread, I shall choose Black Shirts and Reds, written by the wonderful Michael Parenti, as the book we are going to make fun of today. Before I delve into a direct rebuttal, we need to understand Parenti's version of the rise of fascism, so bear with me. According to the wonderful Michael Parenti, Benito Mussolini was an ambitious man with a disregard for socialism that changed sides after the Italian upper class offered him financial support, turning himself into a battering ram to break down strikes and cooperatives. Not only that, but the evil fascists had attacked workers and socialists, and to top it all off, by 1921, despite their horrible crimes, only 162 fascists had been arrested compared to 2,240 workers, or at least that's how Parenti wants to see it. Another claim of his is that Mussolini had met with members of the Federazione Industriale, composed of leaders of industry, bankers, and agribusiness institutions, as a means to plan his evil march on Rome. He got a juicy amount of money for this, according to Parenti, of course. What happened afterwards, according to Parenti, was pretty much 1984 Italian bald man edition, where every single person was being crushed and violently oppressed by the state if they were just innocent communists minding their own business. So let's debunk Mr. Parenti. As we previously saw in my first thread on capitalism and decay, not only had Mussolini changed his mind on socialism legitimately, but nobody actually suspected him of working towards quote-unquote advancing himself. We saw that both a socialist inquiry from 1915 and a police report from 1919 noticed that Benito Mussolini had changed his mind about his understanding of socialism and his approach at war neutrality out of legitimate passion for his beliefs, not money. Not only that, he wasn't just quote-unquote financed by the upper class. If anything, it was the French Socialist Party that primarily financed Mussolini. That's correct. Had it not been for them, he would have never been able to start up his independent newspaper. As we can see, Parenti is pretty misinformed on who actually financed fascism, and Mussolini, he also claims that Mussolini just hated organized labor and socialism. So let's see a quote by the man that was guided by those principles in 1917. The quote reads, by Mussolini, "It could be an anti-Marxist socialism, for instance, a national socialism. The millions of workers who will return to the furrows of their fields after having lived in the furrows of the trenches and will realize the synthesis of the antithesis, class and nation." Another ironic part of his claims is that the quote-unquote fascists attacked workers carrying out strikes. Yes, they did. They attacked communist strikers. Fascists such as Padovani, Rosani, Forniaki, Biaggi, or the Diamri brothers carried out and supported strikes. Mussolini wasn't even opposed to occupations of land either, insofar they were not being led by communists. It's not even as if they were helping landowners for free either, since they were taking from them and giving it to peasants in exchange for protection. So this is where we notice a pattern of fascist mischaracterization, when people such as Parenti will usually make the claim that fascists hated workers and organized labor. What they actually mean is fascists attacked communists, aka the real workers, quote unquote. This is where we notice a lack of honesty from their part, and we can start to strip them away from their talking points. Let's keep going though. According to Parenti, fascists also attacked a lot of socialists and were not even arrested that much for it. His main source for this claim is Paul Dutt's Fascism and Social Revolution, which is absolutely biased, relies on no actual evidence beyond the claims made by the author, who by the way is a communist. The claims are hilarious since they are based on a lack of evidence and taking Italy's situation out of context. So let's start by checking Farrell's biography of Mussolini, which is actually sourced, and it's based on Renzo de Felice's, Mussolini's main biographer's, works. And this quote reads here, "The violence got worse. On a single day, the 8th of May, a week before the election, there was 1,073 acts of violence committed in Italy by fascists and socialists. Only 396 fascists were arrested compared with 1,421 socialists. Between March and July 1922, for example, 899 fascists and 959 socialists were arrested for alleged acts of violence." So, based on what we've read over here, we can see that the figures by Dutt are clearly exaggerated in favor of socialists. He's correct on saying that fascists were arrested at a lesser rate, sometimes, but not always, as we see in the 1922 figures. On the other hand, he openly disregards the fact that red violence was a thing around the time, and it was well known that they were far more violent than fascists. They were the ones trying to carry out the revolution, weren't they? You can't cry about your revolution being squashed by another revolution while you proudly say that capitalism was in danger because of the workers rising up. No, workers were not rising up. Many opposed you and joined fascism. So, furthermore, he says the figures here in this quote undermine the claim that fascism was simply a bourgeoisie counter-revolution, and the rest of the quote by Farrell reads, "Hard times also attacked those to fascism who felt that socialism cannot provide an answer. According to La Stampa, fascism compromised unemployed former officers, poverty-stricken public employees, slum-hit shopkeepers and contractors, students and young graduates, disaffected youths, and ex-revolutionaries who had supported the war." According to a November 1921 census in Il Popolo d'Italia, 24.3% were agricultural laborers, 15% factory workers, 13% students, 12% owner or tenant farmers, and the rest a mix of shopkeepers, traders, professionals, and factory owners. Nearly two-thirds had served in the war, which also meant they were young. So, in these figures, like I mentioned before, undermine the claim that fascism was simply a bourgeoisie counter-revolution. Communists and socialists were arrested at a higher rate because of the fact they were the ones revolting the most at the time, whereas fascists were a reaction towards red violence, not in favor of the regime, but in favor of their own ideas. The quote-unquote workers that were attacked were socialists, willing to die for their beliefs, not just random workers. The idea of violent fascism gets dismantled by the disappearance of violence after the regime had settled, which also debunks the idea of Italy being 1984. So as we can see, fascists opposed red violence with fascist violence, which stopped after the consolidation of the regime. The records used by Farrell display this fact, whereas Parenti relies on Dutt, who you need to believe in his claims just because he says so. Communists give as much as they got in terms of violence, and sometimes got arrested at a higher rate because of their own actions. Mussolini worked several times on stopping fascist violence, and also forced those who disagreed with him to follow through. To finish up this thread, I dare anybody reading this to tell me where did Parenti get his information on the March on Rome. You will not find anything, not even articles written by Italian communists. There is no record of Mussolini meeting with a Federazione Industriale and receiving money from this secret society of capitalists. The fascist movement was quite popular, received money from different sources, and was composed by people from many sectors of society. What did we learn from this? Black Shirts and Reds is a horrible book to learn about fascist Italy, since he certainly did put more effort in his National Socialist Germany section, which I can already tell you is equally as bad. The idea of capitalism and decay being portrayed by Parenti is extremely dishonest and relies on his readers believing his word and the words of others biased socialists that have no real intent on teaching history in a way to make another ideology seem better than theirs. Fascism was not a peaceful movement in its beginnings because of the fact that times required it to be violent. It didn't also just crack down on strikes and land occupations, they attacked only the ones being carried out by fervent socialists and communists. There's no real basis to believe any of what Parenti says, but since some people find it easier to read a few pages on an extremely complex movement such as fascism instead of doing their homework, his books will still have an audience. And that concludes it here. I would also like to add here to show that the society, or the economy rather, that Mussolini created was heavily state-run, and we see in A. James Gregor's book, and I've already went over this before in my last video, but we see in his book he mentions the degree to which the economy was state-controlled and not controlled by private capitalist interests. To quote Gregor, he says, in 1938, after Italy came out of the Great Depression, the economy of Italy was the most state-controlled in all of Europe, with the exception of the USSR. Some facts to prove this are the IRI, which stands for the Institute for Industrial Reconstruction, control the entities that process 67% of minerals, 77% of cast iron, 45% of steel, 80% of all shipbuilding, 40% of all machine products as well. Now, it should also be mentioned that in 1943, the king actually removed Mussolini from power, and he had to enter into northern Italy where he was able to stay in power for a little bit longer before eventually being assassinated. So that tension still did exist between him and the king,